Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Berg, and I'm your host today for today's 2024 Mid-Season Summer and Tropical Outlook webinar. I am joined today by our presenters, Nathan Hamlin, who is one of our long-range weather risk communicators, and Stephen Strum, one of our long-range weather risk senior managers. Before we get started, I am just going to go over some housekeeping rules. One, we are recording this webinar. So at the end, probably in the next couple of days, maybe Monday or Tuesday, we will send out an email with the link to the recording. So either you can listen again or forward it to any of your colleagues who may want to listen as well. If you are having any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature and contact me, who's indicated as the host, and I will help troubleshoot as best as I can. We have saved some time at the end of our presentation for any questions. So if you use the Q&A feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, you can submit the questions at any time throughout the presentation, and either we will address them right in the Q&A feature or at the end when we go over all of our questions. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Nate.
Well, thank you, Andrea, and welcome everybody. We have a lot of information to go over, so we'll get into it quickly. Just a quick introduction. Nathan Hamlin, that is me. I have 20 years of operational forecasting experience, and Stephen Strum, our fearless leader, has been in this game for over 25 years, so we have a wealth of experience to share with you today. And our agenda is as follows. We're going to go over what has happened so far during the tropical season, and then we'll update our 2024 expected seasonal influences and compare that to what the model guidance is saying for tropical parameters, and we'll wrap that up into a seasonal outlook for you. And then I'll turn it over to Steve, who will give us the late summer and fall outlook, August through November, with some cooling degree days, and we'll give a winter preview, pretty high level stuff. It's a little early in the season. And then we'll go over some industry impacts of our outlook, and then questions will come thereafter. So let's go over what's happened so far. It's been relatively quiet except for one storm. 3 named storms total, 1 hurricane and 1 major hurricane, which is category 3 or higher. And we've had 1 named storm landfall so far, which is that hurricane we just spoke of. $6.2 billion in damage so far, and this is the 3rd straight year that no storms have formed prior to June 1st, after we had a string of them where they formed earlier than that. So far, Tropical Storm Alberto, which was just a quick one, 19th to the 20th of June, had max winds of 50 miles per hour, made landfall in northern Mexico. Did not have a lot of damage, but they did have 4 fatalities, all of which occurred in New Mexico. But there were U.S. impacts. There was a 2 to 4 foot storm surge ahead of this into Galveston Bay, which produced some coastal flooding nearby. And we had an EF1 tornado touchdown near Belleville, Texas, which produced some property damage. And our big ticket item so far this year has been Hurricane Beryl, which formed in the middle of the tropical Atlantic on June 28th and lasted all the way through early July. And this one was our first big hurricane of the season. It ended up being a category 5 with max winds of 165 miles per hour. And it made landfall in Matagorda, Texas, and it produced pretty much all the damage from this year's hurricane season so far, 6.2 billion, 50 fatalities, 25 of which occurred in the U.S. Hurricane Beryl produced over 2.5 million power outages in Texas, many of which came from the Houston area, so a very highly impactful storm. And on top of that, the remnants produced 76 tornadoes from Texas and Louisiana, the Arklatex region, through parts of the Ohio Valley, and even into parts of upstate New York on July 8th through the 10th. And then major flooding occurred in eastern Texas with all the rain that came in, especially in the Houston area. But flooding range extended along the path all the way through the Arklatex region, parts of the Ohio Valley, lower Michigan, and into parts of northern New York and northern New England. And the map on the bottom shows you the path it took, where all those reds and yellows are. That's where most of the rain fell. severe weather was a big hit with Hurricane Beryl. Looking at the 8th through the 10th, you can track its path. You can see all the tornado reports along it. On the 8th, on the left, in the Aquatex region, there was quite a smattering of tornado reports in that region. A few less on the 9th in the Ohio Valley, and then we got into upstate New York. Lots of wind damage, some tornadoes mixed in there, and that produced over 150,000 power outages in upstate New York alone from Beryl's remnants. So it was highly impactful, even though upstate New York is very, very far from the landfall point. There's one fatality from a tornado in Mount Vernon, Indiana, and then one from damaging winds in Canastota, New York. Take a look at the tropical season climatology, and we really haven't gotten started yet. Even though the hurricane season starts in the middle of May, we don't usually get too many of them until we get until August through October, which is our peak season. So we're just about there, about another couple, 2-3 weeks, and we will be ramping up climatological production of named storms. And then it ramps down during October and November, but there are even some possibilities that can go beyond that during the busiest years. Let's take a look at some history. Named storms and hurricanes by year. So you can see the green, which is the named storms, and then the yellows, which are regular or all hurricanes, and major hurricanes, category 3 or higher. And this has been since 1950. And the 10-year averages are outlined for each one. Now note, right about the mid-90s, you see the uptick in the named storms, a lot of thicker green bars. And part of that is because we've had a lot of warm water in the Atlantic, but another part of that is that we have better ways of detecting the smaller systems. So satellites have become better over time. We can see some of the smaller ones that maybe we couldn't have seen before. Because you didn't have much of an uptick until we got to that point. So part of it is explained by that, and part of it is explained by the amount of warmth we've had in the Atlantic in recent years. But one thing you'll note is that what you don't see is that the yellow and red lines making any movement to the north. It's been pretty steady. So there hasn't been a corresponding increase in hurricanes or major hurricanes in the Atlantic basin, even since back then. So warmth doesn't necessarily mean storm numbers are going to go off the charts. And hurricane landfall trends kind of reflect that. So this is from research, linked near the bottom. And note each year with the number of U.S. landfalling hurricanes on the left and major landfall hurricanes on the right. And the red line is the trend line. And note it is going down for each of those. And on the right, there was a period from late 2005 through 2016 where no major hurricanes made landfall. And that was a record stretch. We haven't seen that even since 1900. So there was something that made that happen. And of course, we've had some return since, so it is returning to historical distributions, but that helped bring things down a little bit. And looking at hurricane landfall trends, this is each decade total of landfalling hurricanes since the 1850s. And the 2010s was the second lowest observed decade on record, and we were already at 10. And Beryl's going to make 11, so we're at 11 already in the 2020s. So we're returning to historical distributions. Now, I put the AMO index on there, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Index, and what that means is when we're in the red section or the warm section of that phase, that is a lot of warm water in the Atlantic, and the blue means it is the opposite. And some research on the right tells you what tends to happen. Now, warmer waters usually means more hurricanes, which means more landfalls in general. But we break it down between Gulf Coast and Florida and East Coast. It is a little bit more interesting. So doesn't do much to increase or decrease the odds along the Gulf Coast, but it does along Florida and the East Coast, which is pretty interesting there. One thing you have to really watch with these is when they come on shore. If you're near or to the east of the track, tornadoes can be a problem. And what you see here are tornado reports from the remnants of hurricanes or the hurricane as they come on shore. And note where they are. Of course, they're going to be in the Gulf Coast region and along the East Coast, but they can get pretty far inland. There's some in Ohio, Indiana, Missouri, Oklahoma. So they account for 6% of all reported U.S. tornadoes. So they're no small number. And they can occur even with weak remnants and well beyond the landfall point, as Beryl demonstrated earlier this year. And heavy rainfall is also a very significant threat. Here's the highest rainfall observed in each state from a tropical system, really a tropical storm or a hurricane, and some pretty wild numbers on here, even further north, like New York State, 15.2 inches. Uh, but then, of course, Harvey is the standard bearer in 2017 with 60.58 inches. But even in South Dakota, 8 inches. The Pacific Northwest has even gotten in on it to a certain degree as some systems have come on shore. Now, that counts Eastern Pacific systems that come up as well. So anywhere you are, you have at least a threat from remnants, and that's something that needs to be monitored. So the U.S. experienced a period of fewer landfalling hurricanes during the past decade compared to the last 150 years. And no major hurricanes made landfall, as noted, from late 2005 to August 2017. That was a record span, and we've had 8 of them since that time. So it has come back around a little bit. So impacts from the storm of sufficient intensity, if you put it in exactly the wrong place. For example, Hurricane Sandy and Harvey, and showing that disruptions and impacts can be very extreme. And as landfall and intensities match up to the historical distributions, costs will be much greater due to growth and exposure, vulnerability, and property wealth. So we're putting more and more stuff along the coast, right, in the way of these storms. And that increases the odds something will happen. So a landfall in areas of dense population and infrastructure, of course, increase the threat of property damage and loss of life. And the other thing, there's some evidence out there for a recent trend for some of these storms to stall or slow as they approach North American coastal areas. And the slower storms mean higher rainfall totals because it takes them longer to get through. So let's go into the seasonal forecast now with all that stuff in mind. And little educational material, important seasonal factors. The tropical development is enhanced when ocean temperatures are warmer than average, so more fuel for the fire. Vertical wind shear, and that's basically changes in wind with height, whether it be direction or speed. And if you have the least amount of that, you have a better chance of seeing stronger storms. And of course, if you have some large scale rising air around, that'll definitely help. And another thing we like to see is a stronger and wetter African monsoon. So what that does is produce more waves that come off of Africa and into the main development region, into the tropical Atlantic. So if you get more waves and stronger waves, if you put them over those favorable conditions we just talked about, that's when you have your best opportunity to have storms. Of course, if you're missing any of these ingredients, reduced risks of storm development will occur. So let's take a look at the main seasonal drivers. La Nina will develop later this summer, probably in August, if not in the early September, and will probably strengthen through the fall. And notice here in the sea surface temperature forecast from the NMME, the North American Multi-Model Ensemble, see those blues in the tropical Pacific indicative of that La Nina. Well, the other thing here, we have the negative phase or the cold phase of the PDO. And what that basically means that there's warm water in the North Pacific, but it is warmer farther away from the West Coast. There's some cooler water closer. And then the positive Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation that we talked about earlier. There's lots and lots of warm water out there. That's what's happening now and will continue to happen through the hurricane season. So what we like to do is look for years that had some similar ocean temperature patterns, and this can give us some clues as to what might come next. Focusing on ENSO for a moment, here are the ENSO forecasts from modeling centers all across the world, all through the rest of the fall and through the winter, really. And where we are right now is an ENSO neutral. We're pretty close to even. And the thick red line is the model average. There's some of these models are a little stronger than others, but the model average brings us to La Nina during the hurricane season and then strengthens that further from there. So we've got decent confidence that at least a weaker La Nina event will come. And why does ENSO matter? Well, if we take a look at this chart, if you look at all Nino or all ENSO years, neutral ENSO years and El Nino years and La Nina years since 1995, which is the most relevant to our time period, you'll note that the neutral years and the La Nina years tend to produce more storms, more hurricanes, and more major hurricanes than El Nino. So so when we have La Nina around, or even if it doesn't get there for an ENSO neutral, that's still favorable for an enhanced amount of storms. So let's take a look at some analogs and see what they have to say. And let's start with the 1991 to 2020 historical average of 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and major hurricanes would be 3. So that's what an average year looks like in the modern era. If we take a look at La Nina years since 1995, that all of a sudden goes up to 17.4, 8.8, and 3.9 major hurricanes. So that is, of course, higher. And our analog years that we chose this year are even higher than that. 21.1 named storms, 10.9 hurricanes, 5.0 majors. So this is, the analog suggests a very busy season is coming. If we take a look at our top analog years, you can see some tracks there. There's some big hitters, 2020 and 2005, right up to the top there. But some of these other years are also pretty significant. A few things stand out. Number one, the Gulf of Mexico looks busy. And we've already seen it with Beryl. So many years have a lot of tracks in there. And Florida also is under the gun, but a few other things. We have a lot of recurving systems too. So not every storm that comes into the main development region is going to reach the Gulf or the U.S. and cause havoc. There's going to be a few of them at least that recur harmlessly out to sea. So that'll be the types of things that we're looking for. But the analog years do show a potentially very active season. And taking another look at it with analog track density anomalies, a few things stand out. First of all, the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico have the greatest density with the darker red colors there. And the Canadian Maritimes have the least. But you see little patches east of the Lesser Antilles towards Bermuda, and then even further than that out into the eastern tropical Atlantic. So there's some recurving storm risk out there as well, and that's what that is indicating. Notice here it doesn't bring too many tracks near the Northeast. Now, this isn't counting remnants. Remnants are different, but this is counting where the actual systems go. And breaking it down by month through the peak season. So you have August on the top left. Note a lot of opportunities in the Gulf of Mexico and some for some recurving systems. And then note how you might get a little bit of a late start. So even though we might not get the systems in the Eastern Atlantic, once they get closer to the Lesser Antilles, that's when they're most likely to develop. And then September, pretty much the same idea. And then look at October and even November, note the enhanced tracks in the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. And by the time we get into October, we start transitioning to where the average, where more storms come from that part rather than coming from the main development region. So this is indicating that we'll have to watch for storm development later into the fall. And the thing we have to watch, and we've already seen, rapid intensity, rapid intensification density here. And we've already seen it with Beryl. And this is where the risks are highest in the Western Caribbean out towards in the Gulf of Mexico. So we have to watch these storms carefully, even though they could be struggling at times as they come forward. They could hit a favorable patch, and in these areas they could intensify very quickly. So that's the thing, even near the shore too, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's something we have to keep a very close eye on with these systems this year. Current sea surface temperature anomalies, those show are developing La Nina. Notice those cooler waters, those patchwork of cooler waters in the tropical Atlantic. But look at the warmth in the Atlantic. It's already there. All kinds of warmth from the main development region to the Gulf of Mexico. So we're primed and ready from the sea surface temperature front. One little thing we have to get through, though, and part of the reason we've been a little bit quieter lately is Saharan dust. So take a look at all these red colors in the eastern tropical Atlantic. There's a lot of dust out there, and there's a lot more this year than there was last year. And no, there's some system, see a couple waves under there, those gray clouds, trying to get through it, but they are struggling at the moment. But we'll have to watch those couple waves, though, as they get out of this region of dust. There isn't a whole lot in the western main development region to the Caribbean and the Gulf at this time. So if any of these things can survive, you never know. But as of right now, the dust is going to be a prohibiting factor. Now, as we go through August, every year we do this, the dust tends to diminish. So that's the one thing that we think this factor is going to go away, but we think it's at least a contributor to the quiet pattern we've had in the last couple of weeks. So you look at some tropical parameters. Note the warmer Gulf and Atlantic temperatures. This is from the CFS model for the peak season, August through October. All kinds of warmth there. and our La Nina starting to show up. And on the right, we have shear. So we have the blue colors. That means lower shear than average. We have the orange colors. That is where higher shear than average will be. And the model said this earlier in the season, and it's still saying it now. Reduce shear through the main development region. So that's a favorable factor for an active season. ECMWF rainfall forecast. This can give us some clues sometimes. This is through the peak season, the latest forecast. And notice all those green colors through the western main development region, through the Gulf and off the eastern seaboard. So that is an ominous signal for high levels of activity in the tropics. An ECMWF name systems forecast. Note the Atlantic Basin, the one on the right, and it's forecasting an additional 16.2 storms. And this is starting in August, so not counting what's already occurred. So that's well above the average of 12.1 from here. So that's a pretty significant signal as well. So everything's coming up active at the moment. One thing to note, though, it's not quite as extreme as it was in recent runs, though. So there is that, but it's still anomalously high. So quick summary of the environment. A developing La Nina is very favorable for tropical development. And analog years have some big hitters in it, like 2020 and 2005, which are DTN's top two analogs for this year. Warm ocean temperatures are anticipated during the heart of the hurricane season, which are a favorable factor for development. Below average shear, also favorable. And of course, the model guidance with the above normal rainfall, which is another ominous signal. Rapid intensification of storms is favored by analogs, and it'll be a factor through the entirety of this season. So everything's coming up active when it comes to the analog signals. Upper air patterns. Now, where might these storms go? Well, we talked about that lower landfall period where nothing occurred, and this is probably why had a lot of things that led to it. But this is a very strong contributor. Look at a strong trough there was right along the eastern seaboard. Now, a lot of times when systems come through the main development region, if there's a trough there, the high is usually further east, so they'll go between the low and the high, and that means there was a lot of recurving storms around. It also blocked a lot of them from reaching the Gulf. So look how few there were during those 10 years into the Gulf of Mexico compared to how many recurved towards Bermuda. So that we did have a lot of that. And 2020, by comparison, had many storms make it into the Gulf and make it underneath the ridge because the trough wasn't along the eastern seaboard. It was in the central part of the country. So these storms were able to track a little further west before being drawn northward into the Gulf. And we had that happen so many times during that year. And we did have we have a big high here that was located off of the Canadian Maritimes. So whenever that was around, even if you had a recurving storm, this thing blocked it. So it kept things a little bit closer to the eastern seaboard and didn't allow for so many storms to recurve. So that was as bad as it gets, basically. Comparing that to what we have for our 2024 analog average, we have through July through October. Note the big banana high there that's across the central and eastern part of the country with the weakness underneath in the Caribbean. Then we have a low pressures forecast over the Canadian Maritimes. So with the high like that, especially if it stretches across into the Atlantic Ocean like it has been doing, it allows these storms to come further westward and not be drawn northward. Every now and then you'll get a weakness in that, and then these storms will be allowed to recurve north. So there'll be some of that going on, and the low pressure will allow an escape route. So we'll have some of these storms that harmlessly go out to sea, but some of these other ones will be able to make it through and then enter the Gulf of Mexico. Now this won't be all the this gloom and doom for Texas and Louisiana and Florida and other places in between. Some of these will make it into Central America and Mexico as well, because the high doesn't always allow it to come northward. So the Central America will be under the gun a little bit more than usual, we believe, later this season. Current tropical conditions, there's not much to be found, such as it was the last couple of weeks. Couple of waves down in the central tropical Atlantic will bear watching, but so far not much doing. Let's take a look at some statistics now. Name storms after August 1st in the Atlantic Basin. This is every year from 1995 to last year. 2005 and 2020 certainly stand off the page with 21 and 22 named storms. But most of the other years that were considered active were a lot of between 14, 15, 16. So there was 117. So many years had a lot of activity like that. So we think 2024 will be a little bit closer to 2005, 2020, but they had a head start. Like those years didn't have that super quiet period that we're experiencing now. So they had 6 and 9 storms by now versus the 3 that we have going. So we're probably going to finish under those years in terms of named storms a little bit. But we're on a pretty good start. We have a pretty good start for our hurricanes and major hurricanes. We already have one of each in the book. So those might be comparable. So 4-week storm potential. Week 1, these are ECMWF probabilities. This is going into early August. No, not a whole lot there. There's just a little signal with a couple of those waves that could come across into the Hispaniola, Cuba region, or even the Bahamas or Eastern Gulf of Mexico. Something to watch, lower risk at this time. But week 2, week 3, and week 4, note the escalation of chances, and then note some of the recurve looks that we're seeing on there. That goes along with what the analogs were saying. So we think that despite this quieter period, we're about to enter a more active period, especially during the middle part of August. And some other subseasonal factors that make us think so. Note, on the left, we have some upward motion forecasts from the ECMWF that we talked about that earlier, and there isn't a whole lot of it at this time. But if we go forward here, we are going to have more upward motion during the middle part of August, especially when we're getting it right in the right spot. You want to see it right over Africa and the Eastern Indian Ocean. So that's what excites these tropical waves and gets things going. And it also helps lower the shear over the Atlantic Ocean. And the ECFS is showing that. Notice all these red colors right now for week 1. When we go down here to week 4 during the middle part of August, you notice those things disappear to a certain extent. So the model guidance is suggesting that the lower shear will occur, and that's what happens when we have upward motion in those areas. So the way the models are taking us to a place where things are going to change. So our forecast is as follows. We're going to go with 23 named storms, 12 hurricanes, 5 major hurricanes. Now this is slightly lower than our expectations earlier in the year for named storms, but we're staying with our forecast. Lots of hurricanes, lots of majors. And then, I mean, that's still a lot of named storms, but probably not quite as busy as 2005, 2020 on that front. And we have a large area of enhanced risk all the way through the southeast coast, through the Gulf of Mexico, Central America, and all the islands in between. A lot to go on, of course. Bermuda is included. But we have the Northeast U.S. is not highlighted and for enhanced risk, but there's with all these storms out there, it's not to say they won't get one. You have to be on high alert everywhere this year, but the best opportunities will be to the south of there. And of course, we'll have some remnant storms to worry about as we already have. So everybody is going to have to stay hyper vigilant this season. And looking at the storm name list, we have 3 in Alberto, Beryl, and Chris. And Debbie will be next whenever that comes along. And hopefully we don't have to get too far past this list. So key messages. Almost every pattern indicator is favorable for tropical development. And the DTN forecast would be one of the most active seasons on record if it verified exactly, although it would be slightly less than the 2005-2020 super seasons. Analog patterns suggest a higher risk of landfalling storms, especially across the Gulf of Mexico and the southeast. Analog patterns also suggest a high risk of rapid intensification of storms, and storm development may linger into the later fall or even December, such as what they did in 2005 and 2020. And even though the Northeast and places slightly inland from there are not necessarily favored for landfalling storms, the sheer number of storms in the forecast should keep the region on high alert anyway. And of course, a higher risk of remnant systems impacting those areas this year, and they can, on their own, be super disruptive. And even a weaker tropical system can have very significant impacts if it strikes a highly vulnerable location. And with that in mind, I'm going to pass the baton to Steve. He's going to tell us all about what's going to happen outside the tropics for the late summer and fall season. Take it away, sir.
All right, thank you very much, Nate, for walking us through the outlook for the hurricane season. Now we'll jump into the temperature rainfall outlook here for the remainder of the summer season. So first off, looking at the temperature outlook, you can see a whole lot of orange and red on all the maps going forward here through November, the August to October period. Widespread warmth, as you can see, across most of the country, especially across the Rockies and the Plains region. If we go month by month there, you can see certainly a lot of widespread strong heat during the month of August, but not a lot of let up during September either. And then that warmth really just continues right on through October and November as well. There's some risk we could see a week or so somewhere in October, November, where we do see a strong shot of colder air across the central and eastern US. But that could be a notable short-term event, but overall, the warmth should prevail more times than not through November, the way it looks right now. If we jump to precipitation, you can see the big story is going to be a persistent dry pattern across a lot of the Rockies and Plains region. Note that we do have the Gulf Coast areas drier than normal during that period as well, but obviously we are going to be seeing the potential for a lot of tropical systems as well. So in the absence of tropical weather, conditions will be drier than normal in those areas, but obviously any area that does get impacted by a tropical system will see some heavier than normal rainfall with that storm, and so that will skew the overall totals as we head towards the end of this season here. But in general, when it's not being impacted by a tropical storm or hurricane, the overall pattern should be drier than average for those areas. Note the northwestern US, though, could see rainfall pick up a little bit earlier than average as we have this La Nina trying to get going, and so that may enhance the early part of the wet season across that area. Now, if we look at a cooling degree day standpoint here, we are still forecasting this year to come in pretty much at or above the highest CDD total we have on record here for the U.S. on a population weighted basis. Now, this is the entirety of May to September, so not just the June to August period, but when we look at the entire May to September period, one of the notable features of the summer is just every single month pretty much coming in hotter than normal for a large part of the country, which is kind of how we're getting there to that potentially highest CDD total on our record book here. So definitely a very notable summer in terms of the persistent nature of the heat across a large part of the country, and not really any signs of that changing as we head through the remainder of the season. Now, with that heat and with that potential for drier weather across the plains and the Rockies will come an expansion of drought in those areas. And that's already happened. We have seen the drought expand across much of the western half of the country, as well as parts of the eastern US as well. But with the intense heat being focused across the Rockies and as well as parts of the plains, especially as we head into the first part of August, that will allow that drying to progress even faster than it otherwise would. The higher temperatures will produce higher evaporation rates, and we're not seeing a lot of rainfall. So that will certainly lead to an overall expansion of the dry conditions across those areas. And obviously, as we head through late summer into the fall, the big risk with drought is often wildfires across the western US. And so if you look at the maps here, you can see clearly the areas of a higher risk across a lot of the western US. And there are a few things that are maybe a little bit harder to see, but the Sierra Nevada as well as the Cascades actually have near average fire risk. And that's, again, we had a lot of rainfall this past winter, well, a lot of snowfall. And so that took a little bit longer than average to melt across the Sierra. And so as a result, conditions aren't as dry there yet, but that could still change. So even though you don't see the Sierra highlighted as a wildfire risk area, by the time we get to September and October, that is still a possibility for those areas. But outside of the mountain areas, I did see a lot of snow. Certainly the drought is drying things out quite a bit, as well as the hot weather. So widespread wildfire risks likely across the interior West. And even into parts of the plains, you can see Kansas and parts of Colorado having a higher risk. And the eastern US, the drier conditions we had earlier this summer have produced higher wildfire risks for those areas. But with better rainfall chances, especially if you see heavy rainfall from a hurricane or tropical system across the eastern US, that should diminish those risks later in the summer season. Now, severe weather is also another concern throughout the summer season. You can see on the right the red line indicating our tornado count for this year, running well above the average line there, in that black line. In fact, we're actually already well above the total year average. So we still have several months to go in the year, and we're already above where we normally would be by the end of the year. Now we saw that big jump in July with Beryl, and any other additional tropical systems could produce similar jumps in our in our tornado totals. And we'll look here as well farther on at the potential for more risk for not just tropical storm tornadoes, but just overall severe weather across the Midwest areas going forward as well. You can see here on this plot of tornadoes, that little area in New York State, that was all from Beryl. So the tornadoes from Beryl in the middle part of the country are kind of lost with all the other tornadoes for the year, but that clustering in New York kind of stands out. And that was pretty much all just from Beryl. Now, if we go farther on here, one of the factors that we're looking at for the remainder of the summer season is the location of a jet stream. Typically, severe weather, because you need to have wind shear to produce the rotating thunderstorms that give you the tornadoes and bigger hail and things, tend to occur closer to the jet stream. And because of the pattern this year being very hot as it is, that is in part because the jet stream is farther north than normal along the Canadian border. And so those areas there along the Canadian border, especially around the Great Lakes there, where you can kind of see the maximum wind speeds there, that is the area of better focus for severe weather during the remainder of the summer season. Obviously, conditions late in the year aren't quite as favorable as they are, say, in May and June, but nonetheless, those areas will still be much more favorable than average for this time of the year for severe weather for the duration of the summer season. So that will be the main area to watch for severe weather outbreaks going forward here during the late summer season. So kind of summarizing the overall outlook here for the remainder of the summer season into the early fall across the northwestern U.S. Definitely a little bit more seasonable than it's been. They'll still be most likely averaging warmer than normal, but not as intensely hot as what we've seen in recent weeks. And again, potentially rain coming into that area a little bit sooner than average by September. So an early start to the rainy season potentially there. Not quite so the case in Southern California, and so we could potentially see the hot weather there actually peak in September potentially this year. And so that will be something to watch going forward. But for most of the interior West into the plains, the big story is going to be persistent, intense heat, again, with very dry conditions. So widespread wildfire risks across that area. For the Midwest, Great Lakes area, again, persistent warmth there as well. There is some potential for a brief shot of cold air again during October or November in those areas. But overall, more weeks than not should be warmer than average for the duration of the summer as well as the upcoming fall season. And severe weather will be kind of focused across the Great Lakes area relative to other parts of the country outside of tropical systems going forward here as well. So look for that as a risk for that area. Again, for the Gulf Coast, the hurricane season is obviously the big focus. So a higher than average risk for landfalling tropical systems along the Gulf Coast as well as southern parts of the East Coast. Obviously, Florida getting potential risks from both sides. And so that will be the biggest focus. But outside of that, most areas again coming in hotter than average, and also with the warm Gulf and warm Atlantic, we do have more humidity around as well. So higher humidity also a factor going forward for the remainder of the season. But once we get past the hurricane season, overall the conditions do look to be drier than average across the Gulf Coast outside of those tropical impacts. And lastly, across the Northeast, definitely a warm pattern persisting there as well, right on through the fall season. Tropical systems will be more likely to impact the area in terms of ones that come in from the south, making landfall initially, in the Carolinas or in the Gulf, and then heading northeastward up the Appalachians. So those could still bring flooding rain or severe weather risks. And there is still the potential that we could see a direct landfall across the Northeast just because of the sheer number of storms we're going to have this year. So even though the pattern won't be ideal for storms to track that direction, if we do have 25 storms, odds are we'll have a week somewhere in there where the pattern is favorable for a storm to head up towards the Northeast. So don't write off the risk for the Northeast as we head through the remainder of the hurricane season. But definitely the risk is going to be higher farther south. Now, if we shift gears here and look on the renewable side of things, you would expect, obviously, with the widespread heat and the drought across the central US, that probably we're also going to have a lot of sunshine, and that will be the case. Most of the central and the southeastern US do look to see more sun than average across those areas for the remainder of the summer season and right on through the fall season as well. Wind, though, isn't quite as pronounced. Most of the country looks to have fairly average wind speeds. There is some higher probability across portions of the Rockies, as well as the maybe towards Oklahoma, and then obviously potentially across Florida, although some of that would be obviously tropical impacts as well. But for the most part, a large part of the country looking to have fairly average wind speeds during the remainder of the season. If we kind of just summarize the key messages for the summer season here, obviously the big note is the potential for the hottest summer on record on a population weighted CDD basis. So persistent heat is kind of the main factor there, just long duration periods of hot weather for a lot of the country, kind of driving those CDD totals very high. The most intense heat, though, does look to be across the interior West as well as the plains, but pretty much coast to coast, most areas coming in warmer than average for the remainder of the season. The eastern U.S., though, will have higher humidity than average, and so those heat indices will be quite high across the East Coast and surrounding areas, even though the absolute temperatures won't be quite as hot as areas farther west. And with that heat across the West, again, wildfire risks running above average for much of the interior West, as well as even parts of the plains region as well. For severe weather outside of tropical systems, the main risk area will be around the Great Lakes Midwest area. That will be the highest risk area for the remainder of the season. And again, as we mentioned, above average solar generation for most of the country, given the sunny hot pattern, but for the most part, near average wind generation in most areas, except for potentially around the Great Lakes, Northern Plains area, parts of the interior Northwest going forward here. So lastly here, let's take a look at the early preview for the upcoming winter season. We're already getting kind of close there, and so we're starting to think about how things may evolve for this upcoming winter. A big factor will be how the developing La Nina evolves, and that will play a role in what the cold risks are for this winter. But you can see for the most part, our current outlook favors warmth across the south and the east coast, with a near average winter for the northern plains back towards the northwest. But that will vary month to month. You can see that we have December and January warmer than average, but February potentially having some cold risks for much of the central US. There's actually some potential for cold in December as well, but we don't expect any severe cold waves in December to be very long lived. And so a week of very cold weather in December is possible, but overall, we aren't looking to see any long duration cold events during December. And so the month will likely still average warmer than average for most areas. And then January expected to be milder for most areas as well. And then again, those cold risks could become more notable as we head towards the latter part of the winter season during February, but mainly across the Rockies, the Plains area, maybe towards the Great Lakes. And now, while the Southeast does have the winter warmer than normal for the entirety, of those map series there, it's still quite possible we'll see an intense shot of cold air make it into the Southeast or even the Northeast during this winter season, but those should just be briefer in duration and less frequent than what they could be across the northern plains and the Northwest. Going forward here, looking at the precipitation totals, in general with a La Nina, you tend to have higher precip north, lower precipitation across the southern tier. And so that's our initial forecast here. This will be revised as we get closer to the winter season and we have a better idea of how La Nina will evolve and how strong it'll be, and as well as other factors. But in general, this should be a return to the drier pattern across California that we saw prior to the last couple of winters. But we are going to be seeing an increase in rain and snow across the Northwest, and they've been drier there the last couple of winters. So improving conditions this winter across those areas in terms of water supply for next year. The South in general, though, should be drier than average. But again, February is the one area we'll have to watch for a lot of the biggest potential for winter storm impacts, just with the higher cold risk that month, as well as a higher precipitation risk for a lot of the eastern US. So now, if we kind of look at the HDD side of things, you can see that we are looking for a colder winter than last year. And obviously last year was extremely warm, so not a high bar to clear, but at the same time, not overly cold, obviously, kind of on par with what we saw for the 4 winters prior to last winter. So warmer than average, not extremely warm like last year or 2015, 16 or years like that. So definitely milder overall for the East Coast and South at this point, the way it looks. But again, that could still change between now and the start of the winter season, especially if La Nina ends up being weaker than what's currently anticipated. So going forward here, you can see if we look at our industry by industry breakdown, starting off with the utilities for the remainder of the summer into the fall. Obviously, the big story is going to be the widespread heat. So pretty much everyone in the country looking to have more demand for electricity than average because of that heat. So a lot of air conditioning demand, certainly. And so that will be kind of a uniform pattern across the country. But again, those highest or the greatest intensity of the heat more across the middle part of the country than on the coast, but for the most part, everyone hotter than normal. In terms of severe weather risks for power outages related to high winds and maybe tornado risks, that will be tending to be focused across the Great Lakes, Midwestern areas into September. That will start to shift southward, though, as we progress into the fall, as the jet stream shifts farther south again during October and November. Some of those severe weather risks could shift back farther south during the month of October. Obviously, if we see a landfalling tropical storm or hurricane like Beryl, that will bring in a higher risk for, besides the actual tropical impacts, those well inland severe storm impacts like we saw with Beryl, and potentially the Midwest or Northeast as well. So we'll have to watch for that. But of course, obviously, the bigger impact will be direct impacts of power outages like Beryl had in Houston, making widespread damage potentially a concern for some area along the Gulf Coast or East Coast, wherever a storm might happen to hit. And so that will be certainly a big concern there. Now, on the solar side and the wind side, we should see overall above average renewable production going forward, aided by the higher solar and the relatively near to slightly above average wind generation expected going forward here for the remainder of the summer into the early fall season. Now, switching gears here, taking a look at aviation, I mentioned again the higher jet stream wind speeds across the Canadian border areas. So we'll have to look for that as potentially impacting, flight times and that kind of thing across those areas, and also driving the higher risk for severe weather. So, Chicago, Minneapolis, Detroit, Buffalo, those areas in there may have more days where severe weather or just thunderstorms in general are causing delays across those areas. And then again, that could shift farther south during October. And of course, any landfalling tropical system will certainly impact aviation across the Gulf Coast or Southeast, wherever a storm might happen to hit. And again, with those severe weather risks across the Great Lakes and Midwest, besides just the storms themselves, we could be seeing just more days with gusty winds causing delays in those areas. Now moving on here to our next slide. We can advance. There we go. Public safety. For the most part, we are again focused on the heat for a lot of, whether it's outdoor workers or outdoor events, whatever it might be. The very high heat and the high humidity expected during August into September across the eastern US will certainly impact everything from sporting events to concerts and everything else. Schools will be getting back into session here in a few weeks, so there'll be certainly impacts on student athletes and that kind of thing as well as we head into the second half of August and September. So that will be certainly a big concern. Lightning impacts from storms around the Great Lakes, Midwest areas could impact events certainly for those areas. And then obviously tropical storms, hurricanes will be a risk for causing all sorts of issues across the Gulf Coast and Southeast during the remainder of the hurricane season. So all types of possible events and all modes of severe weather possible with those tropical systems, from flooding to tornadoes and high winds, and certainly storm surge causing issues for the immediate coast and any events happening right along those immediate areas. If you look at offshore impacts, mainly in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as shipping in the Atlantic, obviously, with a potentially very active remainder of the hurricane season, you have a variety of potential delays. Tropical systems in the Gulf will produce high waves across the entire Gulf and can cause a lot of delays or keep ships in port or prevent ships from getting into port for several days at a time. With these storm systems, obviously, if damage occurs from any of these storms, at any of the major ports along the Gulf Coast, that could produce even longer delays. But things like LNG, for example, may have some additional periods here where loading and exporting of LNG is just not going to happen, as storms are roving the Gulf. And obviously, even storms that are in the Atlantic, and if you have a shipment trying to go to Europe, you're going to have certainly delays potentially resulting from storms that might be, passing through the Atlantic, especially if we get a period, which we likely will, where we have multiple storms happening at the same time, not just in the Gulf, but as well as in the Atlantic. But one positive side of the warm pattern that we have and our expectation for a warm pattern going through the fall is that we should see fewer cold fronts than usual pass through the Gulf. really right on through the end of the year. And so typically with a cold front, you get a period of high winds behind that, which can cause issues with waves and delays and things in the Gulf of Mexico. But with fewer frontal passages, likely fewer of those days developing during the fall and early winter, where we do see significant impacts from those strong frontal passages. So moving on here to kind of summarize things, looking again at our hurricane season outlook, 23 named storms, 12 hurricanes and 5 major hurricanes. So not really a whole lot of change in our expectation for the remainder of the season. Obviously, widespread heat, the big story for most areas outside of the hurricane impacts. And again, drought developing and expanding across much of the central US for the remainder of the season, and widespread fire risks across the West. But an early start to the rainy season could potentially eliminate that risk across the Northwest by the middle of the fall season. And so with that, we'll kind of look at questions here. We have about 10 minutes. We can take a few here, hopefully. And Nate, do we have anything that you've seen roll in so far?
Well, thank you, Steve, for wrapping that up. A lot of great information there. And I do think we have a couple that have come in. So first and foremost, why was there such a long break in tropical activity right around this time if you expect such a busy season? And I can take that one. Well, we had a period go by where we had a lot of downward motion across the areas where you want upward motion. So we had it across the tropical Atlantic and then over Africa for a period. And what that did was kind of limit the ability for these systems to get going. And the other thing that happened, we had a lot of that dust form that got off of the Saharas and it came over the Atlantic. Usually that dust gives you a kind of a dry layer and it chokes off these storms. So those two things have combined to produce a quiet season. And if that didn't exactly happen to the extent in 2020 and 2005, the big name storms. So there are some differences. It's probably now with this break, it isn't looking like it's going to be quite that extensive. However, most of these negative impacts are going to be reversing themselves during the course of August, and especially as we get deeper into August and into September during the peak season. So more upward motion will be in places where it's favored for systems, and that dust will go away, and some of the wind shear will come down. So when we have all that together, we could, it won't be quite like turning on a light switch, but this quiet period is going to be a distant memory, I think, by the time we get towards late August and September. Let's see, we got another one in there or not. Well, there was a decent derecho across the Midwest earlier, pretty highly impactful event. It brought some damage to different things, power outages and whatnot. What are the odds something like that could happen again?
I'll take that one on since I kind of was talking about the storm risks in that area. Certainly, that is going to be the area that is favored to have additional large organized thunderstorm events like what we just saw with that derecho event. And so again, upper Midwest area, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, those areas eastward are the higher risk, even all the way to like Pennsylvania and New York. We'll have to watch for that during the remainder of the season. With the jet stream kind of being focused there, it's kind of like you get these clusters that can form on the nose of a strong jet streak that sweep across the area, and you get a lot of strong winds aloft that can be brought to the surface and produce those high wind events. So that would be certainly the area to watch for getting another one of those. They don't happen super often though, so it's not like we tend to see a dozen of these a year or anything like that. But certainly, if we do see another one get organized, that will be the area that it likely happens, somewhere in that upper Midwest to interior Northeast area. So Minnesota to New York State down to maybe the northern part of the Ohio Valley is the primary risk area for one of those organized storm events like that to develop again.
That makes a lot of sense. That it happens once during the summer. Sometimes it can come back to get you. Like I remember back in 1998, they had a big one. It was right around Labor Day, and it went all the way across upstate New York. So yep. I mean, yeah, even though we might be getting past peak season for that, it can extend into the fall if you have the right conditions. So thank you, Steve, for that. Let's see, looking at some additional questions. Do you see any risk for storms very late in the season, maybe even into December? And yeah, the answer to that is definitely yes. Looking at how this might happen. If we keep the warm water in the Caribbean to the Gulf of Mexico going, which there's no indications that it won't be there, um, storms could form in that region. Now, we're not going to get the long track storms from the main development region during that time of year. Those risks reduced to almost zero, not exactly zero, anything can happen, but those go away, especially as we get deeper into October. So November, December storms will be, will be more favored to form in the Caribbean. In other words, closer with potentially less lead time to them coming northward. The other thing that could happen is if there's enough storms earlier in the year, that might be the one thing that could cool off some of these waters a little bit, because these storms tend to leave a wake of cooler water behind them for a period, because all the winds and waves, they stir up some cooler water from below and replace some of that surface warmth that hurricanes love so much. So that'll be one impact that we won't know until we see how many systems form and where they go. But that is something that could potentially slow it down. But if it doesn't, I mean, I think conditions will be favorable through November and even well into December, much like they were in 2020 and 2005. Let's see. I haven't looked. Andrea, have any other questions come in from the chat?
I don't see
No,
anything.
I think we are done.
All right. Well, with that, I will pass it back to Andrea to close this out for this session.
Thank you. And thank Nate and Stephen for a fantastic mid-season update to our long-range forecast. And thank all of you participants for joining us today. Like I said in the beginning, we have recorded this session and we will send out a link to the recording in the next few days. So with that, everyone, have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your summer. Thank you.